I mean, what are, from your perspective, again, from both of you, what are the risks of overreach? And we don't need to go Orwellian here. I mean, we live in obviously a very complex world right now that is fast moving on a lot of different vectors right now, and challenging in many ways. And so it's not hard to imagine government overreach, not just in China, but in the United States or in other jurisdictions around the world that are in crisis right now. Lots of things can happen. Incentives can change. What are the real risks that happen here? What could go really badly for individuals and businesses?
From a business perspective, right, the biggest risk of regulatory overreach, set aside, particular U.S. law issues or other country law issues, the risk that exists overall is that historically, whether it's regulators or large enterprises, everybody wants control. And the problem with kind of having control, and this is what made people initially so uncomfortable about the internet, and what makes them uncomfortable about public blockchains, is the lack of control. But what we found last year, what we find over and over again, is if one party controls a network, the other parties don't want to join. So the biggest risk of kind of overreach is that people decide that they don't want to adopt new technology because it presents too much of a substantial risk. And I'll give you a very good example. One of the main ways that manufacturing companies connect to each other is through a system called EDI, Electronic Data Interchange. It's literally as old as I am, which is obviously in my early 20s. But it actually dates from the 1970s. And it's a point-to-point messaging system. And it doesn't work really well if you think about the fact that large supply chains or business operations are actually involve dozens or hundreds of companies across many different countries, right? This is basically saying, I'll only allow you to send a message from one person to another. You're playing a game of telephone, and inevitably the message gets delayed and it gets garbled and causes supply chain foul-ups, right? That technology is still the primary technology in use because companies are reluctant to put their data into somebody else's centrally operated system. Blockchains could have a huge impact on freeing up supply chains, improving the flow of data, reducing inventory, improving working capital, speeding up payments, but they won't happen if every company or country thinks, I don't want to sign up for a system that's controlled by a rival government, by a potential competitor. So the bottom line is that if overreach exists, people will not, companies especially, will not adopt a new technology if they believe their business security, their business privacy, their strategic value is at risk. And that's
sort of a good argument for
an enterprise.
For public chains as the right infrastructure, because it's non-aligned, right? It's
right. It's not aligned. It's not controlled. We see governments with a lot of farsight, like the government of Singapore. They've been very explicit. When they've asked us to work on stuff for them, they've said it's got to be open source, it's got to be public domain, right? It's got to be built on open standards.
Right.
That's the kind of stuff that will get adopted. And I think that that's the big downside. We're gonna say no thanks to a lot of productivity gains if somebody decides that they must have control or they must have the data over others.
Yeah.
So what I worry about with government overreach is politicization of financial intermediaries, right? And what I mean by that is this: in an increasingly cashless world, right, where almost all transactions are meaningful transactions are going to be digital, you're going to have to employ an intermediary, and that intermediary is sort of beholden to their regulator or their supervisor, and that ultimately is a political actor. Mm-hmm. And right now, to date, we haven't seen too many abuses, but you can imagine that political person saying, don't process, transactions for my political enemies. And we've seen this, right? So an example that I like to point out that some folks aren't aware of is, I think it's almost 2 years ago, this started happening, where Governor Cuomo in New York, after one of these terrible school shootings, basically said, he directed the New York Department of Financial Services to basically tell its regulated banks and insurance companies to stop doing business with the NRA. Mm-hmm. And if they didn't stop doing business with the NRA, they would be investigated, and maybe their licenses would be in question. Now, whatever you may think about the NRA is a nonprofit that does what? It uses its First Amendment rights to speech and association in order to defend another constitutional right, a Second Amendment. And look, Governor Cuomo is basically saying, I'm going to put it out of business because they disagree with me on policy. Yeah. And I'm going to do that by saying you cannot transact in this country because of intermediaries.
Right. We're obviously seeing enormous politicization of all kinds of things these days, and a disregard for constitutional mandates and other things. So it's the risks are real, and they're not theoretical. And we're not just talking about China, because everyone likes to point to China as or an authoritarian government. Those risks certainly are real.